In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, 16-year-old Sophie Adams had always been the perfect daughter, straight A's, impeccable manners, and a smile that could light up a room. But beneath that flawless exterior lurked a secret so dark, so terrifying, that it threatened to tear her entire world apart. As her stepfather's car pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sophie's heart raced with panic. She knew that once they stepped through those doors, nothing would ever be the same again. What could possibly be so horrifying that this young girl would rather face her stepfather's wrath than see a doctor? Brace yourself for a tale of shocking revelations, buried truths, and the incredible strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, where perfectly manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses lined the streets, 16-year-old Sophie Adams felt like a ghost in her own life. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pumpkin spice and the promise of Halloween. But for Sophie, it only brought a sense of dread. As she walked home from Lakeview High School, her footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, she kept her head down, hoping to avoid the curious glances of neighbors who always seemed to be watching. Sophie's long, dark hair fell in waves around her face, creating a curtain that shielded her from the world. Her olive skin, a testament to her mixed heritage, was pale from spending too much time indoors. She clutched her textbooks to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white with tension. Every step closer to home made her heart race a little faster, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. As she approached the two-story colonial house she called home, Sophie noticed her stepfather's sleek black Audi in the driveway. Robert was home early, and that never boded well. She paused at the end of the walkway, her mind racing with excuses to delay going inside. The perfectly trimmed hedges that lined the property seemed more like prison walls than decorative landscaping. Taking a deep breath, Sophie steeled herself and walked up to the front door. As she reached for the handle, it swung open, revealing Robert's imposing figure. At 6 feet 2 inches, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, he cut an intimidating silhouette against the warm light of the foyer. "You're late," Robert said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of disappointment that made Sophie's stomach churn. "I'm sorry," Sophie mumbled, her eyes fixed on the welcome mat. "Mrs. Talbot kept us after class to discuss the midterm project." Robert's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "Look at me when you're speaking, Sophie. You know better than that." Reluctantly, Sophie raised her gaze to meet his. The intensity in his eyes made her want to shrink away, but she knew that would only make things worse. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's better," Robert nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Your mother's preparing dinner. Go wash up and help her set the table." As Sophie hurried past him, she caught a whiff of his expensive cologne, a scent that once represented safety, but now filled her with anxiety. She made her way to the kitchen, where her mother, Linda, was stirring a pot on the stove. Linda's once vibrant red hair was now streaked with gray, and worry lines creased her forehead. "Hi, sweetie," Linda said, offering a tired smile. "How was school?" Sophie shrugged, setting her backpack on a chair. "Fine," she replied, her standard answer to everything these days. She began pulling plates from the cabinet, the familiar routine offering a small comfort. As they worked in silence, Sophie couldn't help but notice how her mother's hands trembled slightly as she chopped vegetables. There was a time when the kitchen was filled with laughter and music, but that seemed like a lifetime ago now. The sound of Robert's heavy footsteps approaching made both Sophie and Linda tense. He entered the kitchen, his presence filling the room. "Something smells good," he said, placing a hand on Linda's shoulder. She flinched almost imperceptibly, but Sophie caught it. "Just a simple pot roast," Linda replied, her voice artificially cheerful. "Sophie, honey, could you get the salad from the fridge?" As Sophie moved to the refrigerator, she felt Robert's eyes on her. "You're looking a bit pale, Sophie," he remarked. "Are you feeling all right?" The concern in his voice sounded genuine, and for a moment, Sophie was reminded of the man who had first entered their lives, the one who had seemed like a knight in shining armor after her father's death. but that memory only made the reality of their current situation more painful. "I'm fine," Sophie insisted, avoiding eye contact as she placed the salad bowl on the table. Robert frowned, stepping closer to her. "You don't look fine. Have you been sleeping well? Eating properly?" Sophie's heart raced as he approached. She knew he was just being a concerned parent, but his proximity made her want to run. "Really, I'm okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Just stressed about school. That's all." Linda interjected, her voice tinged with forced lightness. "You know how it is, Robert. Junior year is tough. All those AP classes and college prep." Robert nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Sophie. "Maybe we should have Dr. Feldman take a look at you. It's been a while since your last checkup." The mere mention of a doctor's visit sent a jolt of panic through Sophie. Her mind raced with all the things a thorough examination might reveal: the sleepless nights, the lack of appetite, the constant state of anxiety she lived in. "No!" she exclaimed, more forcefully than she intended. Both Robert and Linda looked at her in surprise. "I mean," she backtracked, trying to keep her voice steady, "that's not necessary. I'm sure it's just a bit of a cold or something. It'll pass." Robert's expression hardened slightly. "We'll see how you feel in a few days. If you're not better by Friday, I'm making an appointment." Sophie nodded mutely, knowing there was no point in arguing further. As they sat down to dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Sophie pushed her food around her plate, her appetite non-existent. "So," Robert began, his tone deceptively casual, "anything interesting happen at school today?" Sophie shrugged, keeping her eyes on her plate. "Not really." "Come now," Robert pressed. "Surely something must have happened. You spend 8 hours there every day." Sophie could feel the weight of his gaze, knew he was looking for something, a crack in her armor, a hint of defiance. She racked her brain for something innocuous to share. "We started reading The Great Gatsby in English class," she offered. Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. "Ah, Fitzgerald, a classic tale of the American dream gone awry. What do you think of it so far?" "It's interesting," Sophie replied, searching for words that wouldn't invite further questioning. "The characters are complex." "Indeed they are," Robert nodded, taking a sip of his wine. Jay Gatsby, a man who built his entire life on a lie. It's a cautionary tale, really, about the dangers of living in a fantasy. The pointed nature of his comment wasn't lost on Sophie. She felt a chill run down her spine, wondering if he somehow knew about the journal she kept hidden under her mattress, the one place where she allowed herself to imagine a different life. Linda, sensing the growing tension, attempted to change the subject. "I was thinking we could visit the pumpkin patch this weekend. It might be nice to get some fresh air. Maybe pick up a few decorations for Halloween." Sophie perked up slightly at the suggestion. Halloween had always been her favorite holiday, a chance to be someone else for a day, but her hope was short-lived. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Robert said, his tone final. "With Sophie not feeling well, it's probably best we stay home. Besides, I have some work to catch up on." And just like that, the brief flicker of excitement was extinguished. Sophie felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle in her chest. She caught her mother's eye across the table, saw the mixture of sympathy and resignation there. As dinner progressed, Sophie found herself retreating further into her thoughts. She wondered, not for the first time, how they had ended up here, how the man who had once seemed like their savior had become the source of their fear. She thought about her real father, his kind eyes and easy laugh, and felt a pang of longing so intense it almost took her breath away. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of stilted conversation and uncomfortable silences. When it was finally over, Sophie volunteered to do the dishes, grateful for any excuse to be alone. As she stood at the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, she gazed out the window at the darkening sky. A solitary star winked at her from between the clouds, and for a moment, she allowed herself to make a wish. Little did Sophie know that her silent plea would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. as she dried the last plate and prepared to retreat to the relative safety of her room. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family, herself, and the true meaning of strength. The early morning sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the pristine kitchen of the Adams household. Robert stood at the granite countertop, methodically stirring his coffee as he perused the Wall Street Journal. The aroma of freshly brewed Colombian roast filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. As he took a sip from his world's best dad mug, a Father's Day gift from years ago that now felt more like a mockery, Robert's mind wandered to Sophie. Her behavior over the past few months had been increasingly concerning. The vibrant, outgoing girl he had first met when dating Linda had all but disappeared, replaced by a withdrawn, anxious teenager he barely recognized. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled Robert from his thoughts. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her school backpack slung over one shoulder. She hesitated for a moment when she saw him, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Good morning, Sophie," Robert said, his voice carefully neutral. "There's oatmeal on the stove if you're hungry." Sophie nodded silently, making her way to the cabinet to grab a bowl. Robert watched her closely, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spooned out her breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, trying to keep his tone conversational. "Fine," Sophie mumbled, not meeting his gaze. Robert felt a familiar frustration rising within him. He had always prided himself on his ability to fix problems, to take control of situations and bend them to his will. It was what made him successful in business, and it was what had initially drawn Linda to him after the tragic loss of her first husband. But Sophie was a puzzle he couldn't seem to solve. "You know," he began, setting down his newspaper, "I've been thinking about what I said last night, about taking you to see Dr. Feldman." Sophie froze, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. "I think it might be a good idea to move that appointment up," Robert continued. "In fact, I was thinking of calling his office this morning to see if he has any openings today." The spoon clattered against the bowl as Sophie's hand began to shake more violently. "No, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I'm fine. It's just stress from school." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Sophie, look at yourself. You're pale, you're not eating, you barely sleep. This isn't just school stress. Something's wrong. And as your father, it's my responsibility to make sure you're healthy." A flash of something crossed Sophie's face at the word father. Was it anger? Resentment? Robert couldn't quite place it, but it made him uneasy. "You're not my father," Sophie muttered under her breath, so quietly that Robert almost missed it. The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he was transported back to the first time he had met Sophie, a bright-eyed 10-year-old with a gap-toothed smile who had looked at him with such hope. He remembered the day he had married Linda, how Sophie had hugged him tightly and told him she was glad he was going to be her new dad. What had happened to that little girl? Robert took a deep breath, pushing down the hurt and anger that threatened to bubble up. "Biological or not, I am responsible for your well-being," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "And right now, I'm worried about you. We're going to see Dr. Feldman, and that's final." Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "No, please. I promise I'll do better. I'll eat more, I'll go to bed earlier. Just please, don't make me go to the doctor." The desperation in her voice gave Robert pause. This wasn't just typical teenage defiance. There was real fear there. But why? What could Sophie possibly be afraid of? As he studied her face, searching for answers, a memory surfaced. It was from a few months ago, at Sophie's school's open house. He had been talking to her English teacher, Mrs. Hawthorne, who had mentioned some concerns about Sophie's recent essays. "They're much darker than her usual work," Mrs. Hawthorne had said. "Lots of themes about feeling trapped, about putting on a brave face for the world. I wanted to bring it to your attention, just in case." At the time, Robert had brushed it off as typical teenage angst. But now, Looking at Sophie's trembling form, he wondered if he had missed something crucial. "Sophie," he said, his voice softer now, "is there something you're not telling us? Something that's bothering you?" For a brief moment, Sophie's mask slipped. Robert saw a flicker of what? Longing? Relief? But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the blank, guarded expression she had worn for months. "No," she said, her voice steadier now. "There's nothing. I'm just tired." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. He was a man of action, of decisiveness. Sitting back and doing nothing went against every instinct he had. "All right," he said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. I won't make the appointment today, but if I don't see an improvement by the end of the week, and I mean a real, noticeable improvement, we're going to Dr. Feldman. No arguments. Understood?" Sophie nodded quickly, relief evident in her posture. "Understood. Thank you." As she hurried to finish her breakfast and gather her things for school, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and desires. It was what made him so successful in business. But Sophie had become an enigma to him. He watched her rush out the door, her long dark hair swinging behind her, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it guilt, concern, or something deeper? A fear that perhaps he had played a role in creating the chasm that now seemed to exist between them? As the front door closed behind Sophie, Robert made a silent vow. He would get to the bottom of whatever was troubling his stepdaughter. He would fix this, just as he had fixed every other problem that had come his way. Because that's what fathers did. They protected their family, no matter the cost. Little did Robert know that his decision to delay the doctor's appointment would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of their family. As he turned back to his newspaper, trying to focus on the day ahead, he had no way of knowing that the carefully constructed world he had built was about to come crashing down around him. In the quiet of the empty kitchen, the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, counting down the moments to a revelation that would change everything. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the pale faces of those waiting anxiously in the crowded space. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear, a potent mixture that made Sophie's head spin. She sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold all her secrets in. Robert paced back and forth in front of her, his Italian leather shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor. Every few moments, he'd glance at his watch, then at the admissions desk, his impatience palpable. Linda sat next to Sophie, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's knee, a gesture meant to be comforting but which only served to heighten Sophie's anxiety. The events of the past few hours played on repeat in Sophie's mind. The sudden, crippling panic attack during dinner, her difficulty breathing, the room spinning around her. Robert's face, for once showing genuine concern rather than controlled disappointment, as he made the decision to bring her to the ER. And now, here they were, waiting for answers that Sophie desperately didn't want to give. "Sophie Adams?" a voice called out, cutting through the cacophony of the waiting room. Robert immediately straightened, his hand coming to rest possessively on Sophie's shoulder. "That's us," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he often used in board meetings. The nurse, a petite woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, smiled gently at Sophie. "Follow me, please. Dr. Martinez is ready to see you now." As they made their way through the labyrinth of corridors, Sophie felt as if she were walking to her own execution. Each step brought her closer to the moment she had been dreading for months, the moment when all her carefully guarded secrets might come tumbling out. Dr. Martinez's office was a stark contrast to the sterile hospital hallways. Warm, earth-toned walls were adorned with colorful abstract paintings, and a small fountain burbled peacefully in the corner. The doctor herself, a tall woman with warm brown skin and a mass of curly hair, greeted them with a smile that immediately put Sophie at ease. "Hello, Sophie," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Sophie couldn't quite place. I understand you had quite a scare earlier. Why don't you tell me what happened?" Before Sophie could speak, Robert interjected. She had some kind of attack during dinner. Difficulty breathing, shaking, said she felt like she was dying. I thought it might be her heart. Dr. Martinez nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Sophie. And how are you feeling now, Sophie? Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the constant knot of fear in her stomach? The way her heart raced every time she heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs, the crushing weight of expectations that seemed to suffocate her. I'm okay, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Martinez's eyebrows furrowed slightly. I'd like to run a few tests, just to rule out any physical causes, she said. But first, I'd like to speak with Sophie alone for a few minutes, if that's all right. Robert stiffened visibly. I don't think that's necessary. I'm her father. I should be present for any discussions about her health. With all due respect, Mr. Adams, Dr. Martinez said, her tone firm but kind, it's standard procedure to speak with teenage patients privately. It allows them to speak freely about any concerns they might have. For a moment, it seemed Robert might argue further, but a gentle touch on his arm from Linda seemed to deflate him. Fine, he said, his jaw clenched. We'll be right outside. As the door closed behind Robert and Linda, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Dr. Martinez turned to her, her expression softening. Now, Sophie, she said gently, why don't you tell me what's really going on? And suddenly, like a dam breaking, words began to pour out of Sophie. She told Dr. Martinez about the constant pressure from Robert to be perfect, about the way he controlled every aspect of their lives, about the fear that gripped her every time she failed to meet his impossibly high standards. She spoke of her mother's increasing withdrawal, of the tension that filled their home like a toxic gas, of the loneliness that threatened to consume her. As she spoke, Dr. Martinez listened intently, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. When Sophie finally fell silent, exhausted by her outpouring, the doctor leaned forward, her voice low and serious. Sophie, she said, what you're describing sounds like emotional abuse. It's not your fault, and you're very brave for speaking up about it. The word abuse hit Sophie like a physical blow. She had never allowed herself to think of her situation in those terms, had always told herself that Robert was just strict, that he wanted what was best for her. But hearing it from Dr. Martinez, a professional, made it suddenly terrifyingly real. What happens now? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Martinez took a deep breath. Well, as a mandated reporter, I'm obligated to contact Child Protective Services. They'll conduct an investigation to ensure your safety and well-being. Sophie's heart began to race again. No, please, she begged. You can't. It'll destroy my family. My mom, she needs Robert. We can't. Sophie, Dr. Martinez interrupted gently. Your safety and health are the most important things right now. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about getting you and your family the help you need. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Sophie felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. Part of her wanted to take it all back, to pretend everything was fine and go back to the life she knew. But another part, a part that had been silenced for far too long, felt a glimmer of hope. Outside the office, Robert paced anxiously, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Linda sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a storm of emotions playing across her face. As Dr. Martinez opened the door to call them back in, the air in the hallway seemed to thicken with tension. The next few moments would change the course of their lives forever, setting in motion a chain of events that would force each of them to confront hard truths about themselves and their family. In that suspended moment, as Robert and Linda rose to re-enter the office, the future hung in the balance. And Sophie, her heart pounding but her resolve strengthening, prepared herself for the battle that lay ahead, a battle not just for her freedom, but for her very soul. The Adams household stood silent, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within its walls. It had been 3 days since the fateful hospital visit, and the impact of Dr. Martinez's intervention was reverberating through their lives like aftershocks from an earthquake. Sophie sat curled up on her bed, her favorite oversized Lakeview high sweatshirt pulled down over her knees. The room around her, once a carefully curated space of pastel colors and motivational posters, now felt like a cage. Her eyes were red-rimmed from sleepless nights and silent tears. A gentle knock on the door made her flinch. "Sophie?" Linda's voice was tentative, almost pleading. "Honey, can I come in?" Sophie didn't respond, but the door creaked open anyway. Linda stepped inside, her face a mask of worry and exhaustion. She perched on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch Sophie's arm. Sophie instinctively pulled away, and Linda's hand fell limply to her side. "The social worker is here," Linda said softly. "She wants to talk to you." Sophie's heart began to race. This was it, the moment that would determine the course of her future. She nodded silently, uncurling herself from the bed. Downstairs, the tension in the living room was palpable. Robert sat rigidly in his leather armchair, his jaw clenched so tight Sophie could see a muscle twitching. The social worker, a middle-aged black woman named Ms. Tanya Johnson, sat opposite him on the couch, her demeanor calm but watchful. As Sophie entered the room, all eyes turned to her. She felt naked, exposed, as if every secret she'd ever kept was written across her skin for all to see. "Hello, Sophie," Ms. Johnson said warmly. "I'm Tanya. I'm here to talk about what's been going on and to make sure you're safe. Would you like to sit down?" Sophie nodded, choosing a spot on the couch farthest from Robert. Linda hovered uncertainly before settling into a chair by the window. "Now," Ms. Johnson began, her voice gentle but firm, "I've spoken with Dr. Martinez and reviewed her report. Sophie, can you tell me in your own words what's been happening at home?" Sophie's eyes darted to Robert, who was watching her intently. She saw the silent warning in his gaze, the unspoken threat. For a moment, she considered backtracking, telling Ms. Johnson it was all a misunderstanding. But then she remembered Dr. Martinez's words. "You're very brave for speaking up." Taking a deep breath, Sophie began to speak. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she recounted the years of emotional manipulation, the constant pressure, the feeling of walking on eggshells in her own home. She spoke of Robert's controlling behavior, how he monitored her every move, how he made her feel worthless if she didn't meet his impossibly high standards. As she spoke, she saw Robert's face darken, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Linda let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as if hearing these things for the first time. When Sophie finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Ms. Johnson nodded, her expression compassionate. "Thank you for sharing that, Sophie. That must have been very difficult." Robert suddenly leaned forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is ridiculous. I've given this family everything. A beautiful home, financial security, opportunities most people can only dream of. And this is how you repay me? By painting me as some kind of monster?" Ms. Johnson held up a hand, her voice firm. "Mr. Adams, I understand this is difficult, but right now, I need to focus on Sophie's well-being." "Her well-being?" Robert scoffed. "I'm the one who's been looking out for her well-being all these years. Linda, tell them how much I've done for this family." All eyes turned to Linda, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He's always provided for us," she said weakly. Sophie felt her heart sink. Even now, her mother couldn't stand up to Robert, couldn't see the damage he had done. Ms. Johnson nodded, making a note in her file. "I see. Well, given the circumstances, I believe it would be in Sophie's best interest to stay with a relative for a while, just until we can fully assess the situation." "What?" Robert exploded, jumping to his feet. "You can't just come in here and break up our family based on the word of a confused teenager." "Mr. Adams, please sit down," Ms. Johnson said, her voice calm but brooking no argument. "This is a temporary measure to ensure Sophie's safety, while we conduct a thorough investigation." As Robert sputtered in protest, Sophie felt a strange mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She was getting out, away from Robert's suffocating presence. But where would she go? "Sophie has an aunt," Linda said softly, surprising everyone. "My sister, Kate. She lives about an hour away." Ms. Johnson nodded. "That sounds like a good option. Sophie, how would you feel about staying with your aunt for a while?" Sophie thought about Aunt Kate, with her wild red hair and infectious laugh. Kate, who always brought her quirky gifts from her travels and listened to Sophie's problems without judgment. I think that would be okay," she said. Robert's face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous. I won't allow it." "Mr. Adams," Ms. Johnson said, her voice steely, "at this point you don't have a choice. Either Sophie stays with her aunt voluntarily, or I'll be forced to take more drastic measures." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Robert deflated, sinking back into his chair. For the first time since Sophie could remember, he looked defeated. As Ms. Johnson made arrangements with Linda for Sophie's temporary relocation, Sophie felt as if she were watching the scene from outside her body. Her world was crumbling around her, everything she had known being torn apart. And yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a tiny spark of something else. Hope. That night, as Sophie packed her bags, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The girl staring back at her looked different somehow. Older, perhaps, or maybe just more real. As she zipped up her suitcase, she heard raised voices from downstairs. Robert and Linda arguing, their words muffled but their tones clear. Sophie closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. This was just the beginning, she realized. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, it felt like a road she might actually want to travel. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quaint suburban street where Kate's modest two-story home stood. Sophie sat on the porch swing, gently rocking back and forth as she watched a group of neighborhood kids ride by on their bikes. It had been 2 weeks since she'd moved in with her Aunt Kate, and the change of scenery felt both liberating and disorienting. Inside, Kate was on the phone, her animated voice drifting through the open window. "Yes, Linda, she's doing fine. No, Robert hasn't tried to contact her. Look, sis, I think we need to talk about..." Sophie tuned out the conversation, her mind wandering to the events that had led her here. The social services investigation was in full swing, and with each passing day, more of Robert's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. A gentle hand on her shoulder startled Sophie from her reverie. Kate stood there, her wild red curls framing a face creased with concern. "Hey kiddo, your mom sends her love. She's trying to figure things out." Sophie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The complex tangle of emotions she felt towards her mother, love, disappointment, anger, pity, threatened to overwhelm her. Kate sat down next to her, the swing creaking slightly under their combined weight. "Listen, Soph, there's something we need to talk about." The investigator found some irregularities in Robert's financial records. They think he might have been embezzling from his company. Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? But he always said his business was above board. He made such a big deal about integrity and..." "I know, honey," Kate said softly. "It looks like there's a lot we didn't know about Robert." As the implications of this new information sank in, Sophie's mind raced back through the years, recalling snippets of conversations, odd behaviors that had never quite made sense. The lavish vacations, the expensive gifts, the insistence on handling all the family finances himself. "There's more," Kate continued, her voice hesitant. "They found evidence that he's been seeing someone else. For quite some time, actually." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sophie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. An affair? But he was always so controlling of Mom. How could he? Kate wrapped an arm around Sophie's shoulders, pulling her close. Sometimes, people who try to control others are really just trying to hide their own secrets. As Sophie leaned into her aunt's embrace, memories flooded back. The late-night business calls that Robert insisted on taking in private. The mysterious weekend conferences that he never seemed to bring any materials back from. The way he'd fly into a rage if Linda ever questioned his comings and goings. "Does Mom know?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kate nodded solemnly. "She does now. That's part of what we were just talking about. She's not taking it well, sophomore. I think she's finally starting to see Robert for who he really is, and it's hitting her hard." Sophie felt a complex mix of emotions churning inside her. Part of her felt vindicated. All those years of feeling like something was wrong, of doubting her own perceptions, hadn't been in her head after all. But another part felt an overwhelming sadness for her mother, for the life they'd thought they had. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Kate sighed, running a hand through her unruly hair. "Well, the investigation is ongoing. There's talk of criminal charges against Robert. Your mom, she's talking about filing for divorce." The word divorce hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. For years, Sophie had dreamed of escaping Robert's control, of her mother finally standing up to him. But now that it was happening, she felt a strange sense of loss. The life she had known, as difficult as it had been, was gone forever. "I know it's a lot to process," Kate said gently, "but I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever happens, we'll get through it together." Sophie nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She thought about her friends at school, wondering what they'd been told about her sudden disappearance. She thought about her childhood home, now tainted by the knowledge of Robert's deceptions. She thought about her mother, alone in that big house, facing the ruins of the life she'd thought she was building. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in a warm orange glow, Sophie felt as if she were standing on the edge of a vast unknown. The web of lies that had ensnared her family for so long was finally unraveling. But what would be left when it was all said and done? Kate gave her shoulders a gentle squeeze. "Hey, what do you say we order some pizza and watch a movie? I think we could both use a distraction." Sophie managed a small smile. "Can we get pineapple on it?" Kate laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made Sophie feel, for the first time in a long while, that things might actually be okay. "Pineapple on pizza? You're definitely my niece. Come on, let's go decide what to watch." As they headed inside, Sophie cast one last look at the darkening street. Somewhere out there, Robert was facing the consequences of his actions. Her mother was grappling with the destruction of her marriage. And Sophie was taking her first tentative steps towards a future free from fear and control. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles, emotional upheavals, and difficult truths yet to be faced. But as she closed the door behind her, stepping into the warmth of her aunt's home, Sophie felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The courthouse loomed before Sophie, its imposing stone facade a stark contrast to the clear blue October sky. She stood on the steps, her Aunt Kate's reassuring hand on her shoulder, watching as a flurry of activity erupted near the entrance. Reporters with microphones and cameras jostled for position, their excited chatter filling the air. "There he is!" someone shouted, and the crowd surged forward. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she saw Robert emerge from a sleek black sedan. He was impeccably dressed in one of his expensive suits, but there was something different about him. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tightness in his jaw and a haunted look in his eyes. As he pushed through the crowd, flanked by stern-faced lawyers, his gaze locked with Sophie's for a brief moment. She saw a flicker of something, regret, anger. Before she could decipher it, he was gone, swallowed up by the courthouse doors. "You okay, kiddo?" Kate asked softly. Sophie nodded, not trusting her voice. Today was the day of Robert's arraignment. The charges against him, embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, had shocked the community. The man who had cultivated an image of success and moral superiority was now being revealed as a fraud in the most public way possible. As they made their way into the courthouse, Sophie's mind drifted to her mother. Linda had chosen not to attend today, saying she couldn't bear to face Robert. The past few weeks had taken a heavy toll on her. Sophie had visited a few times, each visit more heartbreaking than the last. Linda seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. Her once vibrant presence diminished to a shell of her former self. The courtroom was a buzz of whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Sophie and Kate found seats near the back, trying to avoid the curious stares of those who recognized them. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Sophie found herself studying Robert's back. The man who had loomed so large in her life for years now seemed smaller somehow, diminished. The legal jargon washed over Sophie in a confusing wave. Pleas were entered, bail was discussed, future court dates were set. But it was what happened after the formal proceedings that seared itself into Sophie's memory. As Robert was being led out by his lawyers, Linda suddenly appeared at the courtroom doors. She looked pale but determined, her eyes locked on Robert. For a moment, the bustling courtroom seemed to freeze. "Robert," Linda's voice rang out, clear and strong. "We need to talk." Robert's lawyers tried to hustle him away, but he shrugged them off. "Linda," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and wariness. "I didn't expect to see you here." Linda stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly but her gaze steady. "I've spent weeks trying to understand, trying to reconcile the man I thought I married with this," she gestured vaguely at the courtroom. "I needed to see you, to ask you face to face. Was any of it real? Did you ever truly care about us at all?" The raw pain in her mother's voice made Sophie's heart clench. She found herself moving closer, drawn to the unfolding drama despite her fear. Robert's face twisted into a complex expression, part defiance, part shame. "Of course I cared," he said, his voice low. "Everything I did for our family, to give you and Sophie the life you deserved." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "The life we deserved? You controlled every aspect of our lives, Robert. You made Sophie feel worthless if she didn't meet your impossible standards. You isolated me from my friends and family. And all the while, you were lying, stealing, cheating. I was protecting you." Robert's composure finally cracked, his voice rising. "You have no idea what it takes to succeed in this world. The compromises you have to make. I did what I had to do to stay on top, to provide for my family." "Your family?" Sophie found herself speaking, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We weren't your family, Robert. We were your possessions. Something else for you to control, to mold into your perfect image." Robert's gaze snapped to Sophie, a flash of the old anger in his eyes. But before he could respond, Linda stepped between them, her voice ice-cold. "We're done, Robert. I filed for divorce. Whatever happens with your legal troubles, you need to understand you've lost us. For good." For a moment, Robert seemed to deflate, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. But then, like a cornered animal, he lashed out. "You'll never make it without me," he snarled. "Either of you. You're weak, you've always been weak. I made you what you are." "No, Robert," Linda said softly, but with a strength that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. "We made ourselves what we are, in spite of you, not because of you, and we'll be just fine without you." With that, Linda turned on her heel and walked out, her head held high. Sophie, after a moment's hesitation, followed her mother. As they stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, Sophie felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Linda turned to her daughter, tears shining in her eyes but a smile on her face. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," she said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "For everything. But we're going to be okay now. We're going to build a new life together." As they stood there, holding each other on the courthouse steps, oblivious to the swirling activity around them, Sophie felt a surge of love and admiration for her mother. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, financial struggles, and emotional healing. But for the first time in years, Sophie felt truly hopeful about the future. The web of lies that Robert had woven around them had finally been torn apart. And in its place, Something new and beautiful was beginning to grow, a relationship between mother and daughter based on truth, love, and mutual support. As they walked down the steps, arm in arm, Sophie realized that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, the start of a new chapter in their lives, one they would write together, free from the shadow of Robert's control. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and that, Sophie thought, was the most liberating feeling of all. The crisp autumn air nipped at Sophie's cheeks as she walked alongside Dr. Martinez in the tranquil garden behind the therapist's office. It had been 3 months since the courthouse confrontation, and Sophie had been attending weekly therapy sessions to work through the trauma of the past years. "How are you feeling today, Sophie?" Dr. Martinez asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. Sophie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fallen leaves and late-blooming flowers. "Better, I think," she said slowly. "But sometimes it still feels like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know?" Dr. Martinez nodded understandingly. "That's a common feeling for people who've lived through long-term emotional abuse. It takes time for our minds and bodies to realize we're truly safe." As they rounded a corner in the path, Sophie's mind drifted to the changes of the past few months. Her mother had found a job as an administrative assistant at a local community college, her first job in years. They'd moved out of the big house that held so many painful memories and into a cozy apartment closer to Aunt Kate. It was a simpler life, but Sophie found herself appreciating the genuine warmth and love that now filled their home. "I had a nightmare last night," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert was there, telling me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything without him. It felt so real." Dr. Martinez stopped walking, turning to face Sophie fully. "Remember what we've talked about, Sophie. Those are not your thoughts. Those are the echoes of Robert's abuse. You are strong, capable, and worthy of love and respect." Sophie nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. It was still hard sometimes to separate Robert's voice in her head from her own thoughts, but she was learning slowly but surely. "Have you been using the journaling technique we discussed?" Dr. Martinez asked as they resumed their walk. "Yes," Sophie replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. It helps. Writing down my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. It makes them feel more real somehow. Less like I'm going crazy." Dr. Martinez beamed at her. "That's excellent, Sophie. You're doing the work, and that's the most important part of healing." As they completed their circuit of the garden and headed back towards the office, Sophie felt a familiar mix of emotions wash over her. Grief for the childhood she'd lost, anger at Robert for his betrayal, fear of the uncertain future. But underneath it all, there was a growing sense of strength and resilience. Inside, as Sophie settled into the comfortable armchair across from Dr. Martinez, she found herself thinking about her mother. Linda had started her own therapy sessions, working through years of manipulation and control. It hadn't been easy. There were days when Linda seemed to crumple under the weight of it all, but there were also moments of startling clarity and strength. "I've been thinking about college," Sophie said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her interest piqued. "That's wonderful, Sophie. Tell me more about that." Sophie felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. I always loved writing. Robert used to say it was a waste of time, that I should focus on more practical subjects. But now, I think I might want to study journalism or creative writing." As she spoke, Sophie realized how long it had been since she'd allowed herself to dream about her own future. Robert had always dictated their paths, but now the possibilities seemed endless. "That sounds like a great goal, Sophie," Dr. Martinez said warmly. "Have you talked to your mother about this?" Sophie nodded. "A little. She's been so supportive. She even helped me look up some scholarship opportunities." The rest of the session flew by as Sophie and Dr. Martinez discussed strategies for managing anxiety, techniques for building self-esteem, and plans for the future. As Sophie prepared to leave, she felt a sense of lightness that was becoming more and more familiar. "Remember, Sophie," Dr. Martinez said as they stood at the door, Healing isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. But you're on the right path, and you're not alone on this journey." Sophie nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for the support system. She now had Dr. Martinez, Aunt Kate, her mother, and even a few close friends who had stuck by her through everything. As she stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, Sophie pulled out her phone to text her mom. "Session went well. Love you," she typed, hitting send with a smile. The reply came almost instantly. "So proud of you, sweetheart. Can't wait to hear all about it. Love you too." Sophie tucked her phone away, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. The road to healing was long and sometimes difficult, but she was no longer walking it alone. With each step, each therapy session, each small victory, Sophie was reclaiming her life and her sense of self. As she walked towards the bus stop, Sophie found herself humming softly, a habit she'd all but forgotten in the oppressive atmosphere of Robert's home. The tune was light, hopeful, much like the future that was slowly but surely unfolding before her. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges yet to be faced. But for the first time in years, Sophie felt equipped to handle whatever came her way. She was no longer the scared, silenced girl she had been under Robert's roof. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, braver, and infinitely more herself. And that, Sophie realized, was the greatest victory of all. The auditorium of Lakeview High School buzzed with excitement as families and friends filed in, filling the rows of seats with a sea of expectant faces. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a warm glow over the stage where a podium stood, adorned with the school's crest. In the back room, Sophie stood before a mirror, adjusting her graduation cap. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her gown, a mix of nerves and anticipation coursing through her. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in the hospital, and the journey had been far from easy. But here she was, not just graduating, but preparing to give the valedictorian speech. A gentle knock on the door pulled Sophie from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning to see her mother enter, followed closely by Aunt Kate. Linda's eyes welled with tears as she took in the sight of her daughter. "Oh, Sophie," she breathed, crossing the room to envelop her in a tight hug. "You look beautiful." Sophie returned the embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of her mother's perfume. As they pulled apart, she couldn't help but notice how much younger Linda looked these days. The worry lines that had once seemed permanently etched on her face had softened, and there was a light in her eyes that Sophie had feared was lost forever. "Are you ready, kiddo?" Aunt Kate asked, giving Sophie's shoulder a supportive squeeze. Sophie took a deep breath, nodding. "I think so. I can't believe we're really here." The "we" wasn't lost on any of them. This moment of triumph belonged not just to Sophie, but to all of them. It was a testament to their resilience, their love, and their unwavering support for each other. As they made their way to the auditorium, Sophie's mind wandered to the past 2 years. There had been challenges, of course. Financial struggles as they adjusted to life without Robert's income. The emotional toll of the trial, which had ended with Robert serving time for his crimes. The difficult process of rebuilding trust and redefining their family. But there had also been moments of incredible joy and growth. Sophie had rediscovered her passion for writing, pouring her experiences into stories and essays that had caught the attention of her teachers and peers. Linda had blossomed in her new job, gaining confidence and independence, and their relationship had deepened, evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. As Sophie took her place on stage with the other graduates, her eyes scanned the audience. She spotted her mother and aunt, sitting proudly in the front row. Next to them was Dr. Martinez, who had become not just a therapist but a mentor and friend. And scattered throughout the crowd were faces of classmates and teachers who had supported her through her darkest days. The principal's voice boomed through the auditorium, welcoming everyone and beginning the ceremony. As valedictorian, Sophie would be the last student to speak. She listened as her classmates gave their speeches, each one reflecting on their high school journey and looking forward to the future. Finally, it was her turn. Sophie approached the podium, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began to speak. Fellow graduates, honored guests, family, and friends. As I stand here today, I'm reminded of a quote by the author Glennon Doyle. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. 2 years ago, I thought my world was ending. I felt lost, alone, and afraid of the future. But standing here now, I realized that what I thought was an ending was actually a beginning. Sophie paused, her eyes finding her mother's in the audience. Linda nodded encouragingly, her eyes shining with pride. Our high school years are often described as a time of self-discovery, but for me, it became a journey of self-rediscovery. I had to unlearn the harmful beliefs that had been instilled in me and learn to trust my own voice. It wasn't easy, and I couldn't have done it alone. To my mom, who showed me what true strength looks like. To my Aunt Kate, who offered unwavering support. To Dr. Martinez, who helped me find my way back to myself. And to every teacher, counselor, and friend who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself, thank you. Sophie's voice grew stronger as she continued, her words resonating through the auditorium. She spoke of resilience in the face of adversity, of the power of community, and of the importance of speaking one's truth. As she neared the end of her speech, she felt a surge of emotion. As we leave high school behind and step into the next chapter of our lives, I want to remind each of you that your story is not defined by your darkest moments. It's defined by how you rise from them. Our experiences, both good and bad, shape us, but they do not have to limit us. We have the power to rewrite our narratives, to choose hope over fear, and to build a future that reflects our truest selves. Sophie's final words rang out clear and strong. Class of 2026, we've weathered storms and come out stronger. Now it's time to spread our wings and fly. The world is waiting for us. Let's show it what we're made of. As applause erupted throughout the auditorium, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had done it, not just given a speech, but completed a journey that had seemed impossible 2 years ago. As she rejoined her classmates, accepting hugs and congratulations, she caught sight of her mother and aunt in the audience, both wiping away tears. In that moment, surrounded by the love and support of her family and community, Sophie felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain: college applications, new challenges, and undoubtedly more obstacles to overcome. But she was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. As the graduates tossed their caps into the air, a symbol of endings and new beginnings, Sophie's heart soared with them. She had survived, she had thrived, and now she was ready to write the next chapter of her story, one filled with hope, courage, and endless possibilities. The girl who had once begged her stepfather not to take her to the doctor was gone. In her place stood a young woman ready to face the world on her own terms, armed with the love of her family and the unshakable belief in her own resilience. And that, Sophie knew, was the greatest graduation gift of all. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.